On the night of January 14th, 2021, Corey Johnson lay strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 52 years old. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. COVID-19 had invaded his lungs weeks earlier, and even now, in his final moments, the virus was slowly suffocating him. He didn't need the government's chemicals to struggle for air. The disease was already doing that work. Outside the prison walls, temperatures had dropped below freezing. A small group of protesters held vigil in the darkness, their breath visible in the cold, their signs calling for mercy that would never come. Inside, witnesses sat in metal chairs behind thick glass, waiting to watch a man die. Among them were representatives of the families whose loved ones Corey Johnson had killed nearly 3 decades earlier. They had waited 28 years for this night. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. It didn't happen then. Legal appeals were still being filed. Lawyers were still arguing. The Supreme Court was still deciding whether a man with an IQ of 77 could be put to death by the federal government. So Corey Johnson waited. He lay on that gurney, IV lines already inserted into his arms, while 9 justices in Washington debated whether he was too intellectually disabled to execute. The hours crawled by, 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. Still, he waited. Still he breathed those shallow, COVID-ravaged breaths. Still the witnesses sat in their chairs, some growing restless, some praying, some simply staring at the man who had taken so much from them. At 11:34 p.m., word finally came. The Supreme Court had ruled. The execution could proceed. A prison official asked Corey Johnson if he had any final words. He did. His voice was weak, strained by the virus that was killing him even as the government prepared to kill him faster. "I would like to express my sincere condolences and apologies to the families of the victims," he said. "I am sorry for all of you. I am sorry." Then the chemicals began to flow. Pentobarbital entered his bloodstream, a massive dose designed to stop his heart. Corey Johnson's eyes fluttered. His chest rose one last time, and at 11:34 p.m., the man who had murdered 7 people in 45 days was pronounced dead. He was the 12th federal prisoner executed in 6 months. The Trump administration had resumed federal executions after a 17-year pause and was racing to kill as many inmates as possible before leaving office in 6 days. 3 more would die before the inauguration. Corey Johnson was just another name on the list. The newspapers called him a mass murderer, a drug dealer who had turned Richmond, Virginia into his personal killing ground. A man who shot 3 people in a single house, then chased the 4th into the front yard and killed him too. A man who opened fire on a car full of people, killing 2 and critically wounding 2 others. A man who participated in a 45-day rampage that left at least 11 people dead. All of that was true. But the story of Corey Johnson is more complicated than the headline suggested. It's a story about a boy born to a drug-addicted mother who beat him throughout his childhood. A boy abandoned at 13 and left to survive on his own. A boy who couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't function in a world that had discarded him before he ever had a chance. A boy whose IQ tested so low that his lawyers argued he was constitutionally ineligible for execution. The Supreme Court had ruled in 2002 that executing the intellectually disabled violates the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Corey Johnson's IQ was 77. Adjusted for statistical error, it dropped to 72.8. The clinical threshold for intellectual disability is 70. His lawyers argued he qualified. Federal courts said he didn't. They pointed to his crimes. A man who can plan a triple murder, they reasoned, cannot be intellectually disabled. The planning proves the thinking. And so Corey Johnson died on that gurney, apologizing to the families of people he had killed when he was 23 years old. He had spent more time on death row than he had spent as a free man. He entered prison barely able to read his own name. He left it in a body bag. 3 years after his execution, President Joe Biden commuted the sentences of Corey Johnson's co-defendants. Richard Tipton and James Rohn, the men who planned and participated in the same murders, will now spend the rest of their lives in prison. They will grow old behind bars. They will die of natural causes. To understand why the federal government strapped Corey Johnson to that gurney, why it pumped lethal chemicals into a man already dying of COVID-19, why it executed him while sparing the others, we have to go back nearly 30 years. Back to a time when a single drug was tearing American cities apart. Back to a place where murder became so common that people stopped being shocked by it. Back to a moment when 3 men from New Jersey arrived in Virginia and decided that anyone who stood in their way would die. We have to go back to Richmond, and we have to start with the poison that made all of it possible. They called it crack. It arrived in American cities in the mid-1980s, and nothing would ever be the same. Powder cocaine had always been expensive, a drug for the wealthy, for Wall Street bankers and Hollywood executives. But crack changed the economics of addiction. A dealer could take a few $1,000s worth of powder, cook it with baking soda and water, and multiply his investment 5 times over. Suddenly, getting high was affordable. $10 bought a hit. $50 bought an evening of oblivion. The high was intense. It flooded the brain with dopamine, creating a rush of euphoria unlike anything users had experienced before. But it faded fast. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Then it was gone, leaving behind a craving so powerful that people would do anything to feel it again. They would steal from their mothers. They would sell their bodies. They would betray everyone who ever loved them, all for another 5 minutes of feeling like a god. And where the users gathered, the dealers followed. Young men who saw opportunity in the chaos. Organized crews who smelled money. The crack trade didn't require much to get started. No formal education, no business license, just product, territory, and the willingness to defend both with violence. Richmond, Virginia was not prepared for what was coming. The city had deep roots. It had served as the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and the weight of that history still pressed down on its streets. By the 1980s, Richmond was a city in decline. Factories had closed, jobs had vanished, white families had fled to the suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them. The people left behind were the ones who couldn't afford to leave. They lived in neighborhoods that had been starved of investment for decades, in housing projects where hope went to die. Then crack arrived, and the dying accelerated. The crack trade brought a particular kind of chaos. Unlike the structured heroin operations that had existed before, crack was a democratized drug. Anyone with a few $1,000s could become a dealer. Anyone with $50 could become a customer. The low barrier to entry meant more dealers, more competition, and more violence. Street corners became worth dying for. It was something different, one former addict would later recall. It made people hyped up. But it didn't last long. That's what made you chase it, over and over. The high from smoking crack lasted only minutes, but the destruction it caused lasted generations. Families were torn apart. Children watched their parents disappear into addiction. Young men killed each other over territory and perceived disrespect. The police struggled to keep up. Witnesses refused to cooperate with investigations. The code of silence was enforced with brutal efficiency. Those who talked to police often ended up dead. In this environment of fear and chaos, gangs operated with near impunity. They intimidated entire neighborhoods. They killed without hesitation. It was into this chaos that a group of drug dealers from the Northeast would arrive in late 1991. They had connections to cocaine suppliers in New York City. They had experience running operations in Trenton, New Jersey, and they had no regard for human life. In a span of just 45 days in early 1992, they would kill at least 11 people, leaving Richmond traumatized and desperate for answers. Their crimes would result in one of the most significant federal death penalty cases in American history. This is the story of the Newtown Gang, and to understand how it came to be, we must first go back more than 2 decades before the killings, to a broken home in New York City, where a boy named Corey Johnson was learning that the world had no place for him. Corey Johnson came into the world on November 5, 1968. From his very first days, the odds were stacked against him. He entered a family that was already fractured beyond repair. His mother struggled with drug addiction from the time he was young. His father spent most of Corey's childhood behind bars, leaving him without a male role model or a sense of stability. The apartment where Corey spent his early years was not a home in any meaningful sense. His mother's addiction consumed everything. There was often not enough food. There was rarely enough attention. His mother partied openly in front of her children and made no secret of the fact that she didn't want them around. The basic necessities that most children take for granted were luxuries in the Johnson household. Corey's mother cycled through a series of boyfriends, many of whom were also struggling with addiction. Several were violent. One of them was arrested after attempting to set fire to the apartment. The chaos was constant, the danger ever present. For a young child trying to make sense of his world, there were no answers and no refuge. The physical abuse began early. Corey's mother hit him when he performed poorly in school, which was often. She mocked his intelligence, calling him names that would echo in his mind for decades. When she discovered that he continued to wet the bed well into his preteen years, she responded with cruelty rather than compassion. She beat him with a high-heeled shoe. She refused to wash the soiled sheets, forcing him to sleep in his own urine as punishment. His aunt worried constantly about Corey and his brother. She feared they weren't getting enough to eat. She saw the bruises and heard the stories. Corey's godmother eventually intervened after one particularly bad beating. She took him into her home for several months, providing a brief glimpse of what a normal childhood might look like. But it couldn't last. When Corey was 13 years old, his mother made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. She surrendered him to social services. She simply gave him up. Whatever bond exists between parent and child, whatever obligation a mother has to her son, she walked away from it all. Corey would never really understand why. He would carry the wound of that abandonment for the rest of his life. After his mother gave him up, Corey Johnson entered the foster care system in New York State. He was placed in a residential facility in upstate New York, far from everything and everyone he had known. The institutional life that awaited him was cold and impersonal, a world of rules and routines that did little to address the deep wounds he carried. Corey moved from one facility to another. He never stayed anywhere long enough to form lasting connections. Each transfer meant new faces, new rules, and new disappointments. The educational challenges that had plagued Corey throughout his childhood only intensified. By the time he reached the residential facility, he had already attended at least 10 different schools. Each move meant starting over. Each new classroom meant falling further behind. His records rarely followed him from school to school, making it impossible for teachers to understand the depth of his struggles. Corey had stayed in second grade for 3 years. He repeated third grade. He repeated fourth grade. At the age of 13, he could not recite all the months of the year. He struggled to write his own name properly. Reading was a constant battle. The words on the page seemed to swim before his eyes, refusing to make sense no matter how hard he tried. The system was supposed to help young people like Corey. It was supposed to provide the stability and support that their families could not. Instead, it shuffled him from place to place, counting down the days until he aged out and became someone else's problem. When Corey Johnson turned 18, he reached the maximum age for the foster care system. There was no gradual transition, no preparation for independence. One day he was a ward of the state, the next he was on his own. He had no family waiting to take him in. He had no job skills, no education to speak of, and no plan for the future. He had only the streets. The IQ tests that Corey had taken over the years told a consistent story. His score was measured at 77, just above the threshold that was then used to diagnose intellectual disability. But those numbers failed to capture the full picture of his limitations. He could read and write at only an elementary school level. He struggled with basic tasks that most adults take for granted. Complex decision-making was beyond his capabilities. In 1989, Corey connected with other young men who were involved in the drug trade. The cocaine business was booming in the Northeast. Crack had created enormous demand, and suppliers were getting rich, All you needed was a connection to product and the willingness to sell. Corey had found people who would provide both. The group that Corey joined had roots in Harlem. They called themselves the New York Boys, a collection of friends who had grown up on a single block together. They had started selling drugs in their neighborhood before expanding their operations. When law enforcement pressure made things difficult in New York, they moved their base to Trenton, New Jersey. In Trenton, the New York Boys flourished. The demand for crack was insatiable, and they had a steady supply of cocaine from contacts in New York City. They learned how to cook powder cocaine into crack. They learned how to establish distribution networks. They learned how to deal with competition. And they learned that violence was the ultimate business tool. For Corey, the gang provided something he had never had before. He had friends. He had a sense of belonging. He had money in his pocket and people who seemed to value him. It didn't matter that the price of this belonging would be measured in human lives. For the first time in his existence, Corey Johnson felt like he was part of something. But Corey was never going to be the one in charge. He didn't have the mind for it. He didn't have the ambition. He was a follower looking for someone to follow. And in the New York Boys, there was one man who everyone followed. His name was Richard Tipton. On the streets, they called him Whitey. Richard Tipton was born around 1970, just 2 years after Corey Johnson. But the two men could not have been more different. Where Corey stumbled through life desperate for approval, Tipton moved with confidence and authority. He was smart, he was calculating, he was ruthless. And from an early age, he understood one thing clearly. In the drug business, the man willing to do the most wins. Tipton grew up in Harlem, part of the same neighborhood that spawned the New York Boys. While Corey was being shuffled through foster homes, Tipton was learning the drug trade on the streets. He learned how to buy. He learned how to sell. He learned how to make people fear him. By the time he and Corey crossed paths, Tipton was already the one giving orders. He traveled back and forth between New York, Trenton, and eventually Richmond, maintaining connections at every stop. While others handled day-to-day operations, Tipton kept his eye on the bigger picture. By 1992, Tipton was 22 years old. He had already been involved in the drug trade for years. He understood how the business worked. He knew that territory had to be defended, that competitors had to be eliminated, and that anyone who might cooperate with police had to be silenced permanently. These weren't abstract principles for Tipton. They were operating procedures. Tipton's approach to the drug business was methodical. The organization would purchase powdered cocaine from suppliers in New York City. They would transport it to Richmond, where they would cook it into crack. Then they would distribute it through a network of street-level dealers, taking 2/3 of the proceeds while the dealers kept the rest. The operation required discipline and organization. It required people who would follow orders without question. And it required a willingness to use extreme violence to protect the business. Tipton had all of these qualities, and he surrounded himself with people who shared his ruthlessness. When the New York Boys eventually moved their primary operation to Richmond, Tipton was at the center of the transition. He saw opportunity in a city already drowning in violence. Richmond's murder rate was among the highest in the nation, which meant law enforcement was overwhelmed. It was the perfect environment for an ambitious drug operation to take root and grow. But Tipton and his New York crew had a problem. They were outsiders. They didn't know Richmond. They didn't know which neighborhoods were profitable and which were dangerous. They didn't know who the competitors were or how the local drug scene operated. They needed someone from the inside. They needed a local. James H. Rohn Jr. was exactly what they were looking for. He wasn't from New York or New Jersey. He was a Richmond native, born and raised in the very neighborhoods where the gang wanted to operate. He knew the streets, he knew the customers, he knew the competition, and he was already in the drug business. Rohn was the oldest of the three, 26 years old, in late 1991. He had grown up in Richmond's public housing projects, surrounded by poverty and limited opportunity. He had been dealing drugs on his own for some time, working his own corner and making modest profits. But he had hit a ceiling. Without connections to large suppliers, he could only go so far. The New York boys offered Rohn something he couldn't achieve on his own. They had access to large quantities of cocaine. They had organizational skills developed over years in the trade, and they had muscle. What Rohn brought to the partnership was knowledge of Richmond's drug scene. He knew which corners were profitable. He knew who the competitors were. He knew which neighborhoods welcomed dealers and which ones had too much police attention. In personality, Rohn was volatile and prone to violence. He carried grudges. He held on to slights. He had a temper that flared quickly and a willingness to act on his anger. Where Corey Johnson was a follower who did what he was told, Rohn was unpredictable. He had his own beefs, his own enemies, his own scores to settle. Unlike Corey Johnson, Rohn showed no signs of intellectual disability. He made calculated decisions. He understood consequences. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. He was not manipulated into the drug trade. He chose it. Rohn joined the conspiracy in November 1991. With his arrival, the final piece fell into place. Tipton provided leadership and organization. Corey Johnson provided manpower and a willingness to follow orders. Rohn provided local knowledge and connections. The partnership was complete. Now they had to put it to work. The gang already had a foothold in Richmond. Back in August 1990, before the Trenton operation collapsed, they had begun selling drugs in the Central Gardens area of the city. The early results were promising. Richmond had an enormous appetite for crack, and the New York boys had the supply to meet demand. With Rohn now part of the team, they expanded to a second area called Newtown. It was a low-income neighborhood, the kind of place where drug dealing had already taken root. The locals called the cooked crack, "cook 'em up." The operation grew quickly. The business model was the same one Tipton and Johnson had used in Trenton. They purchased powdered cocaine from suppliers in New York City. They transported it to Richmond by car. They cooked it into crack. Then they distributed it through a network of street-level dealers who kept 1/3 of the profits while the gang took the rest. The economics made the business incredibly lucrative. Powder cocaine was expensive and appealed mainly to wealthy users. Crack was cheap and appealed to everyone. A dealer could buy a quantity of powder, cook it into crack, and multiply his investment several times over. Money flowed in. The operation expanded. Richmond police eventually gave the group a name based on their primary area of operation. They called them the Newtown Gang. The members themselves never used the label, but it stuck. By late 1991, the gang controlled a significant portion of Richmond's crack trade. They had product, they had distribution, they had muscle, they had local knowledge, everything was in place. But running a drug operation in a city with one of the highest murder rates in America meant dealing with problems. Competitors, debts, informants, disrespect. The gang had a way of dealing with problems, and in January 1992, they started using it. January 1992 arrived cold and gray in Richmond. The Newtown Gang had been operating for months now, selling crack throughout the city and eastern Henrico County. Money was coming in, the operation was growing, but so was the paranoia. Tipton, Johnson, and Rohn had reason to be nervous. Law enforcement was paying attention. The bodies were starting to pile up across Richmond, and detectives were asking questions. The gang believed informants were everywhere. Anyone who might cooperate with police had to be eliminated. Anyone who owed money or caused problems had to be dealt with. Anyone who posed a threat to the operation had to die. The violence began on January 4, 1992. Douglas Talley was an associate of the gang. He had been trusted with drug transactions, allowed into the inner circle of the operation. But something had gone wrong. The gang believed Talley had mishandled a deal. Whether he actually did anything wrong or simply fell under suspicion hardly mattered. In the Newtown Gang, suspicion was enough. Tipton and Rohn drove Talley to the south side of Richmond under some pretext. Maybe they told him they were going to handle business. Maybe they told him they needed his help with something. Whatever they said, Talley got in the car. When they reached their destination, Rohn grabbed Talley from behind, restraining him so he couldn't fight back or escape. Tipton pulled out a military-style knife with a 12-inch blade. Then he began stabbing. The assault lasted 3 to 5 minutes. Tally struggled against Roan's grip, but he couldn't break free. The knife rose and fell, again and again. When it was over, Tally had been stabbed 84 times in the head, neck, and upper body. 3 of the blows were so powerful that the blade pierced through his skull. At one point, Tipton had to brace his feet against the car door to pull the knife free from Tally's head. Douglas Tally was the first victim of the Newtown Gang's 45-day killing spree. He would not be the last. 9 days passed. The gang continued selling drugs, they continued making money, and they continued watching for threats. Douglas Moody was a rival. He sold drugs in the same area where the Newtown Gang operated. In the logic of the crack trade, this made him an enemy. Competition meant lost profits. Lost profits meant someone had to pay. On the evening of January 13, 1992, Tipton and Roan went to Moody's apartment. They didn't come to talk. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to kill. Tipton shot Moody twice in the back. The bullets tore through him, but Moody didn't die immediately. Desperate to survive, he dove through an open window and tried to escape. He hit the ground outside and started running, bleeding from his wounds, hoping to reach safety. He didn't make it far. Roan had a knife, a military-style blade that had been stored at a nearby apartment. He chased Moody down in the front yard and caught up with him. Moody was already wounded, already weakened from the gunshots. He couldn't fight back. Roan stabbed him 18 times. Moody died in the yard, just feet from the window he had jumped through, trying to save his own life. 2 men were now dead in 10 days. Both killings had been brutal, far beyond what was necessary. Tally had been stabbed 84 times. Moody had been shot and then stabbed 18 times. The extreme violence was deliberate. The gang was sending a message. This is what happens to people who cause problems. The next day, Corey Johnson would claim his first victim. On January 14, 1992, one day after Douglas Moody was chased down and killed, the gang turned its attention to another rival. His name was Peyton Johnson. Despite sharing a surname with Corey Johnson, the 2 men were not related. They were simply competitors in the same deadly business. Peyton Johnson had been selling drugs in areas the Newtown Gang considered their territory. He was taking customers that belonged to them. He was making money that should have been theirs. In the drug trade, this kind of competition was not tolerated. James Roan handled the scouting. He was the local, the one who knew Richmond and its people. He located Peyton Johnson at a tavern in the city and confirmed the target was there. Then Roan left. His job was done. Shortly afterward, Corey Johnson entered the tavern with another person. They walked through the door, spotted Peyton Johnson, and approached him. They were carrying semi-automatic weapons. They didn't say anything. They just opened fire. Peyton Johnson died from his wounds. His only crime was trying to make money in the wrong neighborhood. For Corey Johnson, this killing was a turning point. He had been part of the gang for years now. He had watched others commit violence. He had followed orders. But until this moment, he had never killed anyone himself. Whatever reluctance he might have felt, whatever understanding he might have had of right and wrong, he crossed a line in that tavern. He was a murderer now. The killing also showed how the gang operated. Roan identified and located the target. Corey Johnson carried out the killing. The person who scouted wasn't the person who shot. The person who shot wasn't from the neighborhood. This division of labor made it harder for witnesses to connect the pieces. 2 weeks passed after Peyton Johnson's death. The gang continued its drug operations, selling crack throughout Richmond and eastern Henrico County. Money flowed in. The operation appeared to be functioning smoothly. But the killing wasn't over. Louis Johnson worked as a bodyguard for a rival drug trafficker in Richmond. In the dangerous world of the crack trade, protection was a valuable commodity. Dealers who had money needed people willing to defend them and their territory. Louis Johnson was one of those people. He had encountered members of the Newtown Gang before. At some point, Louis Johnson had threatened Corey Johnson, possibly in connection with his work protecting his employer. The details of the threat were unclear. Maybe it was serious. Maybe it was just words spoken in anger. But in the world of the Newtown gang, any sign of disrespect had to be answered. Louis Johnson had made himself a target. On January 29, 1992, 15 days after Peyton Johnson was killed in the tavern, the gang moved against Louis Johnson. Corey Johnson, Vernon Lance Thomas, and James Rohn tracked him down in an alley. Rohn pulled his car around the corner. He got out of the vehicle and approached Louis Johnson. Then he raised his weapon and opened fire. The shots echoed through the alley. Corey Johnson and Lance Thomas emerged from the car, both carrying weapons. They joined in, firing at Louis Johnson as he tried to escape. The bullets hit him. He went down. Louis Johnson lay on the ground, wounded but still alive. He was bleeding, struggling, maybe hoping that someone would come to help him. No one did. They walked up to him and fired 2 more shots at close range. The shots were unnecessary. Louis Johnson was already dying. But the gang wanted to make sure. They wanted to send a message. When you cross the Newtown gang, you don't just die. You die hard. 3 days after Louis Johnson's death, the gang would carry out its deadliest day of violence. They were done for that month. February 1st, 1992 began with unfinished business. James Rohn had been having problems with a man named Torek Brown. The specifics of their conflict were never made public. Word reached Corey Johnson and Vernon Lance Thomas that Rohn had gone to Brown's apartment. They armed themselves with semi-automatic weapons and headed to the location. When they arrived, they found Rohn waiting outside. The 3 of them approached the apartment door together. Torek Brown's half-sister, Martha McCoy, answered their knock. Her 3 young children were inside with her. She had no idea what was about to happen. The men asked if Brown was there. McCoy called her half-brother to the door. When Torek Brown appeared, all 3 gang members opened fire. Brown was killed almost instantly. Martha McCoy was hit multiple times. She collapsed, bleeding from her wounds as her children screamed. The apartment filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. McCoy survived, barely. Her children were physically unharmed but had witnessed their uncle's murder and their mother's shooting. They would carry those images for the rest of their lives. The gang left the scene. Torek Brown was dead. Another problem solved. But the day was far from over. Just hours after Torek Brown's murder, the gang set out to kill again. Dorothy Armstrong owed them money. It wasn't a large amount, just a few $100s for crack cocaine she had received but hadn't paid for. In any normal business, such a debt might result in a phone call or a lawsuit. In the drug trade, it could be a death sentence. Dorothy knew she was in danger. She had gone to live with her brother Bobby Long, hoping to escape the gang's reach. She thought she would be safe there. She was wrong. Jerry Gators, another member of the gang, knew where Dorothy was hiding. He told Corey Johnson. The information was a death warrant. Corey Johnson and Gators got into a car driven by Richard Tipton. A 4th person, never identified, was also present. They drove to Bobby Long's house in a residential neighborhood. It was late in the day. Families were sitting down to dinner. Children were finishing homework. It was an ordinary evening for everyone except the people in that car. Tipton stayed behind the wheel. Johnson and Gators got out and retrieved a bag of guns. They walked to the front door and knocked. Bobby Long opened the door. He was 30 years old. He was trying to protect his sister. He had no idea that opening his door would be the last thing he ever did. Corey Johnson raised his weapon and fired. The first shots hit Dorothy Armstrong and Anthony Carter, who were both inside the house. Dorothy had been hiding from her debt. Anthony Carter had nothing to do with drugs at all. He was simply visiting. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Both of them went down. Both of them died. Bobby Long turned and ran. He made it out the front door and into the yard. He was running for his life, trying to escape the same way Douglas Moody had tried to escape 2 weeks earlier. It didn't work. Corey Johnson caught up with him and fired. Bobby Long fell in his own front yard, just feet from the door of his own home. He died there, in full view of anyone who might have been watching. 3 people were dead in a matter of seconds. A woman killed over a few $100s, her brother killed for trying to protect her, an innocent man killed for being present. The date was February 1st, 1992. 4 people had died in a single day. The Newtown gang's killing spree was reaching its peak. 18 days passed after the triple murder at Bobby Long's house. The gang continued operating. They continued selling drugs, they continued making money, but paranoia was eating at them. Law enforcement was getting closer. Someone had to be talking. Someone had to be feeding information to the police. Linwood Chiles fell under suspicion. He was connected to the gang's operation, close enough to know details that could be damaging. Whether he actually spoke to police or simply acted in a way that raised suspicion, the gang decided he had to die. On February 19, 1992, Corey Johnson arranged to meet with Chiles. He convinced him to come along for what seemed like routine business. Chiles had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. He brought along his friend Curtis Thorne and 2 sisters, Priscilla and Gwen Green. The 5 of them were going for a ride, that was all. They met up with Johnson and Richard Tipton. The group drove to an alley in Richmond, a location chosen for its isolation. Johnson had borrowed a car from a woman named Valerie Butler. If anyone found the vehicle later, it wouldn't be traced back to the gang. When they reached the alley, Chiles parked his station wagon. Tipton pulled in behind him. For a moment, everything was still. Then Corey Johnson got out of his car, walked up to the station wagon, and opened fire. He shot everyone inside. Linwood Chiles was killed. Curtis Thorne was killed. Priscilla and Gwen Green were both hit multiple times. The sisters slumped in their seats, bleeding, their bodies torn by bullets. Priscilla and Gwen survived. They were critically wounded, and they would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. But they lived. Chiles and Thorne did not. The February 19 attack marked the end of the killing spree. In 45 days, the Newtown gang had killed at least 11 people. Douglas Talley, Douglas Moody, Peyton Johnson, Lewis Johnson, Torrick Brown, Bobby Long, Dorothy Armstrong, Anthony Carter, Linwood Chiles, Curtis Thorne, and possibly others whose deaths were never connected to the gang. The victims included rival drug dealers, suspected informants, people who owed money, innocent bystanders, anyone who crossed paths with the gang at the wrong moment. The killing was over. Now it was time for someone to answer for it. Before moving forward, we must pause and remember the dead. They were not just names on a court document. They were people. They had families. They had lives that were stolen from them. Douglas Talley was the first to die. He was 27 years old. He had made the mistake of falling under suspicion. The gang stabbed him 84 times and left his body on the south side of Richmond. Douglas Moody was a rival dealer. He was shot in the back and then stabbed 18 times as he tried to escape through a window. He died in a front yard, reaching for safety he would never find. Peyton Johnson was selling drugs in the wrong neighborhood. He was 24 years old. He was shot to death in a tavern by a man who shared his last name but had no other connection to him. Lewis Johnson was a bodyguard who had allegedly threatened a gang member. He was shot in an alley and then shot again at close range as he lay dying on the ground. He was 28 years old. Torrick Brown had a conflict with James Rohn. The nature of the conflict was never explained. He was shot to death in his half-sister's apartment while her 3 children watched. He was 29 years old. Bobby Long was 30 years old. He was trying to protect his sister Dorothy from the gang that wanted to kill her over a small drug debt. He died in his own front yard, shot down as he tried to run. Dorothy Armstrong was 26 years old. She owed the gang a few $100s. She hid at her brother's house, hoping to escape. They found her anyway. She died inside the house, just feet from her brother. Anthony Carter was 31 years old. He had no connection to drugs. He was not a dealer. He was not a customer. He was simply visiting Bobby Long's house when the gang arrived. He was killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Linwood Chiles was suspected of talking to police. He was 30 years old. He got into a car with people he thought were his friends and was shot to death in an alley. Curtis Thorne was with Chiles when the shooting started. He was 24 years old. He died beside his friend. Priscilla and Gwen Green survived their wounds. They were 19 and 21 years old. They spent weeks in the hospital recovering from their injuries. The bullets left permanent damage. Martha McCoy survived being shot multiple times. Her children survived physically unharmed, but they all witnessed violence that no human being should ever have to see. These were the victims of the Newtown gang. 11 dead, 4 more wounded. Countless family members left to grieve. The gang had operated with impunity for 45 days. Now the law was coming for them. The wave of murders that swept through Richmond in early 1992 did not go unnoticed. 11 people dead in 45 days, bodies turning up across the city, witnesses too terrified to talk. The Richmond Police Department knew they had a major problem. They assigned some of their best detectives to the case. C.T. Woody Jr. took the lead on the homicide investigation. Woody was a legendary figure in Richmond law enforcement. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 235 pounds. He had built his career by developing relationships in the very neighborhoods where crime was most prevalent. He knew people. More importantly, people knew and trusted him. In a city where witnesses were afraid to talk, where snitches end up in ditches was more than just a saying, Woody's network of contacts was invaluable. He had spent years earning trust on the streets. He didn't just arrest people, he talked to them. He listened. When he gave his word, he kept it. That reputation opened doors that stayed closed for other detectives. Woody and his team began working the cases. They interviewed witnesses. They gathered physical evidence. They looked for connections between the murders. The pattern was clear. The same names kept coming up. Tipton, Johnson, Roan. These weren't random killings. They were connected. They were organized. But knowing who did it and proving it in court were two different things. The gang had terrorized witnesses into silence. People who might have talked were afraid they would end up like Linwood Chiles, shot dead in a car for being suspected of cooperating with police. The breakthrough came from inside the gang itself. Jerry Gators was a member of the organization. He had sold drugs. He had accompanied Tipton and Roan to the triple murder at Bobby Long's house. His own cousin, Anthony Carter, had been killed that day. Gators knew everything. And now he was willing to talk. Woody later said that Gators was the key to actually getting the investigation started. Once Gators began cooperating, the whole case opened up. He provided information about the gang's structure, its drug operations, and its murders. He named names. He described how the killings were planned and carried out. He gave investigators the roadmap they needed. Another gang member followed Gators. Sterling Hardy agreed to cooperate as well. Hardy had been present during at least one murder. He had driven the car for another. He wasn't a major player in the organization. He had never dealt drugs himself. He had never pulled a trigger. But he knew enough to help prosecutors build their case. Both men understood what they were risking. They had seen what happened to people suspected of cooperating with police. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Cooperation offered the only hope of avoiding the death penalty. They made their choice. With informants providing inside information, the investigation accelerated. Detectives identified more witnesses. They gathered more evidence. They reconstructed the timeline of the murders, placing each defendant at each crime scene. The picture that emerged was damning. A small group of men had turned Richmond into their personal killing ground. They had killed for money. They had killed for revenge. They had killed because someone looked at them wrong. In April 1992, just 2 months after the last murder, a federal grand jury handed down indictments. Richard Tipton, Corey Johnson, and James Roan were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. The Newtown gang's reign of terror was over. Now they would face justice. The decision to prosecute the Newtown gang in federal court was significant. Most murders are prosecuted under state law, in state courts, with state-level penalties. Virginia had the death penalty, and the gang's crimes certainly qualified. But federal prosecutors saw an opportunity to use a different approach. In 1988, Congress had passed a law known informally as the Drug Kingpin Statute. It was designed to target large-scale drug traffickers who commit murder to further their criminal enterprises. Under this law, federal prosecutors could seek the death penalty against drug dealers who killed in connection with their operations. It was part of the government's response to the crack epidemic, an attempt to address the violence that came with the drug trade. U.S. Attorney Richard Cullen believed the Newtown gang case fit perfectly under this law. The defendants had run a continuing criminal enterprise. They had distributed large quantities of crack cocaine, and they had committed multiple murders to protect and expand their drug business. Cullen sought approval from the Justice Department to bring capital charges. The approval came. Corey Johnson, Richard Tipton, and James Rohn would face the federal death penalty. It was a groundbreaking case. According to Cullen, it was the first time in the country that multiple defendants faced the death penalty simultaneously under the drug kingpin law. The eyes of the legal world turned to Richmond. Whatever happened here would set a precedent. The decision to go federal gave prosecutors several advantages. Federal courts moved faster than state courts. Federal judges had more control over their dockets. Federal sentences tended to be harsher, and the federal death penalty, while rarely used, was available for cases exactly like this one. For the defendants, the federal prosecution meant facing some of the most experienced attorneys in the government. Assistant U.S. Attorney Howard Vick Jr. was assigned to lead the prosecution. Vick had been watching the Newtown gang's violence unfold for months. He had seen the crime scene photos, he had read the autopsy reports. He described the defendants as mass murderers. A fourth defendant, Sandra Rivas, was also charged. She had been part of the drug conspiracy but was not accused of participating in any of the murders. She faced serious time, but not death. 3 other gang members were also indicted. Vernon Lance Thomas faced charges including 4 murders. Jerry Gators and Sterling Hardy, the cooperating witnesses, faced lesser charges in exchange for their testimony. Judge James R. Spencer was assigned to preside over the case. Spencer was a federal district judge with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. He imposed a gag order on prosecutors and defense attorneys, preventing them from discussing the case publicly before trial. The trial was set for January 1993. Almost exactly 1 year after Douglas Talley became the first victim, the men accused of killing him would face a jury. On January 17, 1993, the trial of the Newtown gang began in U.S. District Court in Richmond. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers filled the defense table. Spectators crowded the gallery. Family members of the victims sat on one side. Family members of the defendants sat on the other. Reporters took notes, waiting to tell the city what happened inside. 3 defendants sat facing the jury. Richard Tipton was 22 years old. Corey Johnson was 24. James Rohn was 27. Each faced multiple counts of murder. Each faced the possibility of execution. Sandra Rivas, charged with conspiracy but not murder, sat separately. Judge Spencer called the court to order. The prosecution would go first. Assistant U.S. Attorney Howard Vick Jr. stood to deliver his opening statement. He told the jury what they were about to hear. 11 people dead in 45 days. Stabbings, shootings, bodies left in alleys and front yards. A woman killed over a debt of a few $100s. An innocent man killed for being in the wrong house at the wrong time. Children forced to watch their mother get shot. Even that accumulation of witnesses cannot describe the sheer weight of the brutality of the crime that has been committed, Vick told the jury. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on insider testimony. Jerry Gators and Sterling Hardy, the cooperating gang members, would take the stand. They would describe the drug operation from the inside. They would testify about the murders they had witnessed. They would point at the defendants and say, "These are the men who did it." More than 90 witnesses were scheduled to testify. Among them was a 7-year-old girl. She had been in Martha McCoy's apartment on February 1, 1992. She had watched James Rohn shoot her uncle Toric Brown. She had watched all 3 defendants shoot her mother. She had seen things no child should ever see. Now she would tell a jury about it. The defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, cooperating insiders who knew every detail. The defense attorneys couldn't deny the murders had happened. The bodies were in the ground. The question was whether their clients were responsible. The defense strategy focused on 2 arguments. First, They would try to separate the defendants from each other. Rohn, who was implicated in fewer murders than the others, sat apart from Tipton and Johnson at the defense table. His attorneys wanted the jury to see him as a minor player, not a leader. Second, the defense would argue that even if murders occurred, they were not part of a continuing criminal enterprise as required by federal law. If the prosecution couldn't prove the murders were connected to the drug operation, the federal death penalty wouldn't apply. Defense attorney Eric White framed the case for the jury. "This story is a part of the war on drugs," he said. "War is not fair. Justice must be." The battle lines were drawn. The trial would last more than a month. Day after day, the prosecution presented its case. Witnesses took the stand and described what they had seen. Forensic experts explained the physical evidence. Detectives walked the jury through the investigation. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a picture of organized violence. Jerry Gators testified about the drug operation. He explained how the gang obtained cocaine from New York, cooked it into crack, and distributed it through street dealers. He described the hierarchy. Tipton at the top, giving orders. Corey Johnson following those orders. Rohn providing local knowledge and muscle. Then Gators testified about the murders. He had been in the car when they drove to Bobby Long's house. He had watched Corey Johnson retrieve the bag of guns. He had been there when Johnson opened fire on Dorothy Armstrong, Anthony Carter, and Bobby Long. His own cousin, Anthony Carter, had died that day. Sterling Hardy took the stand next. He described being present during one murder and driving the car for another. He wasn't a shooter, but he had been part of the operation. He knew how it worked. Medical examiners testified about the autopsies. They described Douglas Talley's 84 stab wounds. They described the gunshot wounds that killed the other victims. They showed photographs. The jury saw what the gang had done. Surviving victims testified as well. Martha McCoy described being shot multiple times while her children watched. Priscilla and Gwen Green described the attack in the alley, the moment when Corey Johnson opened fire on their car. Then came the 7-year-old. She was small, she was scared, but she told the jury what she had seen. She described watching J.R. shoot her uncle, Torek Brown. She described watching the men shoot her mother. She had been standing right there when it happened. She would never forget it. Prosecutor Vick told the jury, among more than 90 government witnesses, this child would testify about watching J.R. blow away his uncle and shoot his mother 6 times. The defense cross-examined the witnesses, challenging their credibility. They pointed out that Gators and Hardy were getting reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. They suggested that the cooperators were lying to save themselves. But the core facts were undeniable. The murders had happened. Multiple witnesses placed the defendants at the scenes. The defense could attack the details, but they couldn't change the reality of 11 dead bodies. The trial continued through January and into February. The prosecution rested its case. Now it was the defense's turn. The defense attorneys faced an impossible task. Their clients were accused of 11 murders. The evidence was overwhelming. The best they could do was try to create doubt. Richard Tipton's lawyers argued that while murders had occurred, they were not part of a continuing criminal enterprise. The New Jersey operation and the Richmond operation were separate, they claimed. The profits from Richmond were minor. The legal requirements for the federal death penalty had not been met. Corey Johnson's defense took a different approach. His attorneys acknowledged that he had participated in violence, but they argued that he was a follower, not a leader. He did what he was told. He didn't plan the murders. He didn't give the orders. He was a tool used by smarter, more ruthless men. The defense also began laying groundwork for what might come later. Johnson's attorneys called a psychologist who had evaluated their client. The psychologist testified that Johnson had a low IQ, just 77, bordering on intellectual disability. He had severe learning disabilities. He could barely read or write. He had been abandoned by his mother at age 13 and shuffled through institutions for the rest of his childhood. The prosecution pushed back. They argued that Johnson's murders were planned and calculated, not impulsive acts. A man incapable of making calculated judgments doesn't walk into a house, shoot 3 people, chase down a 4th, and kill him too. Johnson knew what he was doing. James Roan's defense focused on distancing him from the other defendants. He sat apart from them in the courtroom. His attorneys emphasized that he had joined the conspiracy late, just weeks before the killings began. He was less involved than the others. He was a local dealer who got caught up with dangerous outsiders. Defense witnesses testified about the defendants' backgrounds: difficult childhoods, abusive parents, poverty, limited education, lack of opportunity. The defense wanted the jury to understand that these men had not been given a fair start in life. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness. 11 people were dead. Their families sat in the courtroom, watching, waiting. The defense rested. Closing arguments were delivered. The case went to the jury. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On February 3, 1993, they returned to the courtroom. Judge Spencer called the proceedings to order. The forewoman stood to deliver the verdicts. Corey Johnson, guilty of 7 counts of murder, guilty of 20 additional criminal charges related to drug trafficking. Richard Tipton, guilty of 6 counts of murder, acquitted of 2 counts, guilty of numerous drug and conspiracy charges. James Roan, guilty of 3 counts of murder, acquitted of 1 count, guilty of additional charges. Sandra Rivas, guilty of conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. The verdicts were a complete victory for the prosecution. All 3 main defendants had been convicted of multiple murders committed in furtherance of their drug operation. The jury had rejected the defense arguments. They had believed the witnesses. They had seen the evidence. The convictions meant that Johnson, Tipton, and Roan now faced the penalty phase of the trial. The same jury that convicted them would decide their sentences. The options were life in prison without parole or death by lethal injection. Prosecutor Vick addressed reporters outside the courtroom. He couldn't discuss the case in detail due to the gag order, but his satisfaction was evident. The government had proven its case. The first ever federal death penalty trial involving multiple defendants under the drug kingpin law had resulted in convictions across the board. For the families of the victims, the verdicts brought a measure of relief. The men who killed their loved ones had been held accountable. But the trial wasn't over yet. The question of punishment still remained. The penalty phase began on February 9, 1993. The penalty phase forced the jury to weigh the value of human life. On one side were the victims, 11 people dead, families destroyed, children traumatized, a community terrorized. On the other side were 3 defendants, each with his own story of hardship and disadvantage. Prosecutor Howard Vick Jr. reminded the jury of what they had heard during the trial. The stabbings, the shootings, the bodies. The 7-year-old girl describing how she watched her uncle die. Remind yourself that you are looking at 3 mass murderers, ladies and gentlemen, Vick said. The defense presented mitigating evidence. For Richard Tipton, his lawyers raised his attention deficit disorder. It made him impulsive, they argued. Hyperactive, unable to fully control his behavior. He wasn't evil. He was sick. For Corey Johnson, the defense painted a picture of a broken childhood. His mother was a drug addict who beat him and abandoned him at age 13. He had bounced through foster homes and institutions. His IQ was borderline. He could barely read. He was a follower who had been manipulated by smarter, more ruthless men. For James Roan, his attorneys argued that he was born with brain damage. He suffered from learning disabilities. He had attention deficit disorder. He couldn't process stress the way other people did. When pressure mounted, he reacted with violence because his brain couldn't find another way out. The defense lawyers had done everything they could. They had humanized their clients. They had explained their childhoods. They had offered reasons, if not excuses, for the violence. Now it was out of their hands. The jury filed out of the courtroom to deliberate. They had heard weeks of testimony. They had seen photographs of the dead. They had listened to a 7-year-old describe watching her uncle get shot. They had heard the defendants' life stories, the abuse and neglect and missed opportunities that shaped them into killers. Now they had to decide. Prison or death. The deliberation stretched on. Hours passed. The jury asked for evidence to be brought back. They reviewed testimony. They talked. They argued, they prayed. 20 hours of deliberation spread across multiple days. On February 16, 1993, word came that the jury had reached its decision. The courtroom filled again. Families of the victims took their seats. Families of the defendants sat across the aisle. The three men who had terrorized Richmond sat at the defense table, their futures about to be decided. Judge Spencer called the court to order. The four women rose. Corey Johnson, the man who had walked into Bobby Long's house and killed 3 people. The man who had opened fire on a car full of people in an alley. The man convicted of 7 murders. Death. 7 times over. 1 death sentence for each life he took. Richard Tipton, the leader. The man from Trenton who had brought the operation to Richmond. The man who had stabbed Douglas Talley 84 times. Death for 3 of his murders. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for 3 others. James Roan, the local. The man who had provided the knowledge and connections that made the operation possible. The man convicted of 3 murders. Death for 1. Life without parole for the other 2. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. 3 men. 11 death sentences between them. The rest of their lives would be spent in prison, waiting either for execution or for some court to intervene. Under federal law, Judge Spencer had no choice. The jury's recommendations were binding. On June 1, 1993, he formally imposed the sentences. Corey Johnson received 7 death sentences. Richard Tipton received 3 death sentences and 3 consecutive life terms. James Roan received 1 death sentence and 2 life terms. The 3 men were shackled and led from the courtroom. Their next stop was the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Federal death row. They would join the small number of prisoners awaiting execution by the federal government. After sentencing, Corey Johnson was transferred to the federal death row facility at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He would spend the next 28 years of his life there, waiting to see whether the government would carry out his execution. The appeals process in federal death penalty cases is lengthy and complex. Multiple levels of courts review the conviction and sentence, looking for errors that might warrant reversal. For Johnson, Tipton, and Roan, this process would stretch across nearly 3 decades. The first direct appeal went to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, which rejected the defendants' challenges in 1996. Subsequent appeals raised new issues and were met with additional rulings, most of them unfavorable to the defendants. During his years on death row, Corey Johnson tried to improve himself. His lawyers would later describe him as a gentle soul who never broke a rule in prison. He attempted repeatedly to pass the GED examination, the high school equivalency test, that would have demonstrated at least a basic level of academic achievement. Despite his efforts, his intellectual limitations made passing the test impossible. He could not overcome the deficits that had haunted him since childhood. In 2006, execution dates were set for Johnson, Tipton, and Roan. All 3 men were scheduled to die. But the executions were stayed because of an ongoing legal challenge to the federal lethal injection protocol. The challenge, Roan v. Holder, prevented any federal executions from taking place, while the courts considered whether the method was constitutional. The lethal injection litigation dragged on for years. Meanwhile, life on death row continued. The men aged, the world outside changed. The crime itself faded from public memory, becoming just another tragic chapter in Richmond's violent history. By 2020, Corey Johnson had been on death row for 27 years. He was 52 years old, no longer the young man who had arrived in Richmond, hoping to find belonging in the drug trade. The question of whether he would ever be executed remained unanswered. For 17 years, the federal government carried out no executions. The last federal prisoner put to death before 2020 was Louis Jones, Jr., executed in 2003 for the kidnapping and murder of a young female soldier. After his death, a combination of legal challenges and changing priorities brought federal executions to a halt. In 2020, that changed. The Trump administration announced its intention to resume federal executions after the lengthy pause. Beginning in July 2020, the Department of Justice began carrying out death sentences at an unprecedented pace. In November 2020, officials announced that 5 people would be executed between December and January: Brandon Bernard, Alfred Bourgeois, Lisa Montgomery, Corey Johnson, and Dustin Higgs. The timing was significant. Donald Trump had lost the presidential election to Joe Biden, who opposed the federal death penalty. The executions would take place during the transition period, the weeks between the election and the inauguration. For opponents of capital punishment, the timing seemed deliberately provocative. The last time as many as 5 executions had occurred during a presidential transition was 1884 to 1885. The Trump administration appeared determined to carry out as many death sentences as possible before losing the power to do so. Johnson's execution was scheduled for January 14, 2021, just 6 days before Biden would take office. His co-defendant Richard Tipton was not among those scheduled to die. Neither was James Rohn. Only Johnson faced imminent execution, a fact that would take on greater significance in the years to come. In December 2020, as his execution date approached, Johnson contracted COVID-19 while in custody at Terre Haute. The virus had been spreading through the federal prison complex, infecting both inmates and staff. Johnson's lawyers argued that proceeding with the execution while he was still recovering would cause him to suffer unnecessarily, potentially constituting cruel and unusual punishment. The legal fight over his execution was just beginning. As January 14, 2021 approached, Corey Johnson's attorneys made desperate attempts to save his life. They filed multiple appeals raising different issues, hoping that at least one court would grant a stay of execution. The first argument focused on intellectual disability. Johnson's lawyers presented the evidence compiled by Dr. Ollie and other experts, showing that their client met the criteria for such a diagnosis. They argued that executing him would violate Atkins v. Virginia and the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit considered the claim and rejected it. In a close 8-7 vote, the judges declined to grant Johnson an evidentiary hearing on the issue. Judge James A. Wynn wrote a passionate dissent, stating that Corey Johnson is an intellectually disabled death row inmate who is scheduled to be executed later today. Newly available evidence, he argued, convincingly demonstrates that he is intellectually disabled current diagnostic standards, but no court has ever considered such evidence. The second argument focused on the First Step Act, a criminal justice reform law passed in 2018. Johnson's lawyers argued that he was eligible to seek a sentencing reduction under the new law and should be given the opportunity to do so before being executed. The third argument focused on COVID-19. Johnson had tested positive for the virus in December 2020. His lawyers contended that the infection had damaged his lungs and that the lethal injection process would cause him to experience something like drowning as the drugs took effect. A federal district judge initially agreed, granting a stay of execution that would have delayed the process until at least March 2021. But the stay was overturned. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the execution by a 2-1 vote. Johnson's team appealed to the Supreme Court, which declined to intervene. Around 10 p.m. on January 14th, the court denied both of Johnson's final appeals. The execution could proceed. On the night of January 14th, 2021, Corey Johnson was prepared for execution at the federal prison complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. He had been moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber, where he spent his final hours with a chaplain and eventually his attorneys. For his last meal, Johnson requested pizza, a strawberry milkshake, and jelly-filled donuts. He received the pizza and the milkshake. The donuts never arrived. In his final written statement, he would note this small disappointment. The pizza and strawberry shakes were wonderful, but I didn't get the jelly-filled donuts that I ordered. What's with that? This should be fixed. At the appointed time, Johnson was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to a cross-shaped gurney. Witnesses gathered in separate viewing rooms, one for his family, one for the families of his victims, and one for media observers. When asked if he had any last words, Johnson appeared distracted. He focused on the room where his family was seated, a space separated from him by glass. "No, I'm okay," he said initially. Then, a few seconds later, still looking at his family, "Love you." The execution began. A single dose of pentobarbital was administered through intravenous lines attached to both of his arms. Johnson lifted his wrist and waved to someone in the family viewing room. From that room, witnesses could hear someone praying and offering words of reassurance. For about 2 minutes after the injection started, Johnson continued trying to speak. Then his eyes closed, his mouth fell open, and movement ceased. He was pronounced dead at 11:34 p.m. Eastern Time. From the viewing room where victims' families had gathered, witnesses heard clapping and whistling. After 28 years, justice had been served for 7 murders. Corey Johnson was the 12th federal prisoner executed since July 2020 and the second to last before Joe Biden took office. In the days following Corey Johnson's execution, his attorneys released his final written statement. In it, he apologized to the families of his victims and asked that each of them be remembered by name. Lewis Johnson, Anthony Carter, Dorothy Armstrong, Curtis Thorne, Linwood Chiles, Peyton Johnson, Bobby Long. "I want to say that I am sorry for my crimes," he wrote. "I wanted to say that to the families who were victimized by my actions. I would have said I was sorry before, but I didn't know how. I hope you will find peace." His lawyers mourned his death while acknowledging the pain he had caused. "We loved Corey Johnson, and we knew him as a gentle soul who never broke a rule in prison and kept trying, despite his limitations, to pass the GED," they said. The fact Corey Johnson should never have been executed cannot diminish the pain and loss experienced by the families of the victims in this case. We wish them peace and healing. 2 days after Johnson's execution, Dustin Higgs became the 13th and final person executed during the Trump administration's unprecedented federal execution spree. After that, President Biden imposed a moratorium on federal executions, effectively ending the practice indefinitely. Nearly 4 years later, on December 23, 2024, President Biden took another step. He commuted the death sentences of 37 of the 40 remaining federal death row inmates, converting their punishments to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Among those spared were James H. Roan Jr. and Richard Tipton, Corey Johnson's co-defendants in the Newtown gang case. The commutation meant that Corey Johnson remained the only one of the 3 main defendants to be executed for the 1992 Richmond murders. Prosecutors and investigators who had worked the case expressed outrage. "The things they did? They should have been electrocuted. All of them," said former Sheriff C.T. Woody, who had led the homicide investigation decades earlier. Federal prosecutor Toby Vick called the commutations appalling and said the Newtown gang warranted the ultimate punishment. "It's tough to find a nastier group than the Newtown gang," he said. "If the death penalty is ever warranted in cases, this was a case that warranted the death penalty." For the families of the 11 people killed in 45 days of violence, there is no neat conclusion. Their loved ones remained gone. The years have passed, but the grief endures. And for those who study the criminal justice system, the Corey Johnson case raises questions that have no easy answers. Was he truly intellectually disabled? And if so, was his execution constitutional? Did the timing of his death, during a rushed series of executions in a presidential transition, serve the interests of justice or something else? And what does it mean that his co-defendants, guilty of crimes just as horrific, will now live out their days in prison rather than face the same fate? These questions will be debated for years to come. But for Corey Johnson, the debate ended at 11:34 p.m. on January 14, 2021, in a small room in Indiana, far from the streets of Richmond, where it all began. Subscribe to No Way Out for more in-depth, true crime documentaries examining capital punishment and the American justice system.